Imagine an ordinary man living among the colonizers of Gilead, who suddenly rises up against the most powerful king of his time, declaring a drought that would devastate all the land. His name is Elijah, and his words are laden with the power of God himself. Not afraid to face the royal wrath, he announces a prophecy that plunges the kingdom into a severe drought. But Elijah is not alone in his journey. Guided by a divine voice, he finds refuge in the desert, survives with the help of ravens, and witnesses miracles that defy logic. From multiplying a widow's last meal to bringing a child back to life, Elijah walks between the divine and the human. In a scenario where gods are challenged and kings are confronted, Elijah becomes the spokesman of the eternal. And when the battle between good and evil reaches its climax, only a fire from heaven can reveal who is the true God. This is the story of Elijah, a prophet who dared to face the powers of this world and witness the supernatural as few have ever seen. It was a time of uncertainty in the land of Israel, a place torn between old traditions and the new ways that the rulers tried to impose. The air was heavy with the drought that scorched the earth, and whispers of a coming disaster spread through the villages. Amidst this, a man emerged from the shadows of obscurity. His name? Elijah the Tishbite. Now, let me tell you about this man. He wasn't royalty, nor a warrior. He was just a humble man, living among the settlers of Gilead. But he carried something within him that made even kings tremble. He carried the word of the eternal God. And one day he walked right up to King Ahab, a man known for his wicked ways and for bowing down to false gods. Elijah stood before him, unwavering, and declared, "As surely as the eternal God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the years ahead unless I give the word." Can you imagine the audacity? The boldness? This wasn't just a prediction of bad weather. It was a direct challenge to the king's authority and the false gods he worshipped. Ahab must have stared at him in disbelief. But Elijah didn't flinch. He knew that he was the voice of the one true God in a land drowning in idolatry. And with those words, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the stunned silence of the king and his court. The drought began, just as Elijah had foretold. Day by day, the skies remained stubbornly clear, and the sun beat down relentlessly. Rivers dried up, crops failed, and the people grew desperate. Yet, even as the land withered, Elijah followed a different path. God whispered to him, "Leave this place and go east. Hide by the brook called Cherith, near the Jordan River. Drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to bring you food." And so, Elijah disappeared from sight, but not from God's watchful eye. Can you picture it? There he was, alone in the wilderness, sitting by the flowing waters of a hidden brook. Morning and evening, ravens brought him bread and meat, right into his hands. It was as if nature itself bowed to the will of the eternal. While the kingdom suffered, Elijah found sustenance in the most unlikely of places, provision that came straight from heaven. But this was just the beginning of his journey. As the drought dragged on, the brook eventually dried up, and God had yet another challenge waiting for Elijah. But for now, he stood as a reminder to everyone in Israel. The word of the eternal God was not to be ignored. And as the sun baked the earth dry, the people began to wonder, just who was this prophet, and what would he do next? The brook, once a lifeline in that barren wilderness, finally dried up. The drought Elijah had foretold was in full swing, and even he could feel its relentless grip. As he gazed at the parched riverbed, God's voice came to him again, with new instructions, ones that would lead him to a place of even greater uncertainty. "Go to Zarephath in the region of Sidon," God said. "I've commanded a widow there to supply you with food." Now imagine this for a moment. A widow in a foreign land, in the midst of a devastating drought, tasked with sustaining a prophet. It made no sense, but Elijah trusted those words and set out on the journey. He arrived at the city gates of Zarephath, tired and thirsty. And there she was, a woman gathering sticks, her face lined with the weariness of survival. Elijah called out to her, "Please, bring me a little water in a jar so that I may drink." The woman turned to fetch the water, but just as she did, he added, "And bring me please, a piece of bread." You could see the hesitation in her eyes, the weight of her struggle. She stopped and faced Elijah, her voice barely above a whisper. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she said, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a last meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Her words hung heavy in the air, a desperate resignation to fate. But Elijah, undeterred, spoke with the calm confidence of someone who knew the power he served. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says: the jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Imagine the struggle within her, the fear, and yet a flicker of hope. She went back to her small home, did as Elijah had said, and made that small offering. And then, something incredible happened. Day after day, as she reached into the jar, there was still flour. And as she tilted the jug, oil continued to flow. It never ran dry, just as Elijah had promised. In the heart of a drought-stricken land, this small home became a place of miraculous provision. Elijah, the widow, and her son lived through those long, dry months, sustained by the faith of one woman and the word of a prophet. The miracle was not just in the food that lasted, but in the bond that formed. A bond between a man of God and a woman who dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope even in the most desperate of times. But as they found a fragile peace in their daily survival, a new shadow crept into their lives, one that would test their faith even further. But that fragile peace was shattered when the widow's son fell ill. What began as a small cough grew worse by the day, until the boy's breathing turned shallow and labored. His mother watched in terror as the life seemed to drain out of him, slipping through her fingers like the last grains of flour in that jar. She held her son in her arms, feeling his small body go limp, and a wail of grief tore from her throat. She turned to Elijah, her face twisted with anguish and bitterness. "What do you have against me, man of God?" she cried. "Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Elijah's heart sank as he looked into her desperate eyes. He knew that pain, that searing question of why suffering comes even to those who have faith. He gently took the boy from her arms, cradling the lifeless body against his chest. "Give me your son," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. Carrying the child up the narrow stairs to the small room where he had been staying, Elijah laid the boy on his own bed. Then, shutting the door behind him, he fell to his knees, and a deep cry rose from his soul. "Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with, by causing her son to die?" he pleaded. Elijah stretched himself over the child 3 times, each time pouring out his heart to the heavens. "Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." His voice echoed in the small room, the desperation of a man who had seen miracles yet now faced a challenge that seemed too great, even for him. And then, in the stillness, something shifted. The boy's chest rose with a sudden, shuddering breath. His eyes fluttered open, and life returned to his small, fragile body. Elijah stared for a moment, hardly daring to believe, before gathering the child into his arms once more. He descended the stairs with a steady step, the boy held close, and when he reached the widow, he gently placed her son back into her arms. Her hands trembled as she touched the warmth of his skin, the breath that now filled his lungs. "Look," Elijah said softly, "your son is alive." Tears streamed down the widow's face as she held her child tight, disbelief and relief mingling in her eyes. She turned to Elijah, her voice hushed with awe. "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." For Elijah, this was not just a moment of victory. It was a reminder that the God he served held power even over life and death. But it was also a turning point for the widow, who had seen the power of God's provision in the jar of flour and the jug of oil, and now felt his touch in the heartbeat of her son. Yet, as miraculous as this moment was, Elijah knew his mission was far from over. The drought still held the land in its grip, and a confrontation was brewing. One that would pit him against the darkness that had seeped into Israel, and the false gods that held its people in chains. But the days of quiet in Zarephath couldn't last forever. The drought persisted, and with each passing season, the weight of the dry earth pressed harder on the hearts of the people. As the third year of the drought began, the word of the Lord came to Elijah once more. It was time for him to leave the safety of the widow's home and face the king who had brought Israel to its knees. "Go, present yourself to Ahab," God commanded, "and I will send rain on the land." Elijah knew this would be no simple meeting. King Ahab's kingdom had been ravaged by the drought, his livestock starving, and his people desperate. The once proud king now ruled over a land of dust and despair. Elijah set off, making his way across the parched fields and cracked riverbeds, until he came upon a man named Obadiah, Ahab's trusted servant. But Obadiah wasn't like his master. He feared the Lord, and during Queen Jezebel's murderous campaign against God's prophets, he had risked his life to hide 100 of them in caves. When Obadiah saw Elijah, he fell to the ground in shock. "Is that really you, my lord Elijah?" Elijah nodded, urgency in his voice. "Yes, it is I. Go. Tell your master, Elijah is here." But fear darkened Obadiah's face. He knew Ahab's wrath and the desperation that had grown in the king's heart. "What have I done wrong, that you would hand your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? The king has searched every kingdom and nation for you, and now, if I tell him you're here and the Spirit of the Lord carries you away, he will kill me. I have served the Lord since my youth. Don't you know what I did when Jezebel was killing the prophets?" Elijah's eyes softened, and he raised a hand, calming Obadiah's fears. "As surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will present myself to Ahab today." Obadiah ran to his master, delivering the message. And soon, Ahab came to meet Elijah, anger blazing in his eyes. The king rode up to the prophet, dust swirling around him. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" he spat. Elijah's voice rang out, unshaken. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." The challenge was set, and Ahab, desperate and perhaps intrigued by the prospect of an end to the drought, agreed. Soon, all of Israel gathered on the slopes of Mount Carmel. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension palpable as 2 altars were prepared, one for the prophets of Baal and one for Elijah. Elijah stood before the crowd, his voice echoing against the mountainside. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." The people were silent, unsure, eyes darting between the lone prophet and the mass of Baal's servants. Elijah turned to the prophets of Baal, gesturing toward the altar. "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." The prophets of Baal went to work, preparing their sacrifice, arranging the wood, and laying the bull upon it. From morning until noon, they danced around the altar, chanting, "Baal, answer us." But the sky remained empty, the air still. Nothing. As the hours dragged on, Elijah began to taunt them, his voice cutting through their frantic cries. "Shout louder. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." The prophets slashed themselves with swords and spears, letting their blood flow in a desperate attempt to rouse their silent god. But even as the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent, there was no voice, no answer, no fire. Then Elijah called the people closer. He repaired the altar of the Lord using 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, the man who had been named Israel. He dug a trench around the altar, arranged the wood, and placed the bull upon it. Then, to the astonishment of everyone, he said, Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. They did so, and he told them to do it again, and yet again, until the water drenched the sacrifice and filled the trench. The crowd held its breath as Elijah stepped forward, lifting his face to the sky. His prayer was simple, yet it carried the weight of a nation's fate. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. As his words faded into the silence, suddenly, a flash tore through the sky, a fire so fierce it consumed not just the offering, but the wood, the stones, the soil, and even the water in the trench. The people fell to the ground, faces pressed into the earth, crying out in awe and fear, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Elijah stood over the stunned crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone escape." The people rushed forward, capturing the false prophets, and Elijah led them down to the Kishon Valley, where their lies and deceptions met a swift end. But as the last cries of Baal's prophets faded, Elijah knew his work was not yet done. He turned his eyes back to the horizon, where the dry land awaited the promise of rain. He would climb the mountain once more, to pray for the heavens to open. And as he ascended, he carried with him the weight of Israel's hope, knowing that this battle between falsehood and truth had only just begun. Elijah climbed to the summit of Mount Carmel, leaving the chaos and the cries behind him. There, on the peak, he knelt down with his face between his knees, the posture of a man who knew that true power lay not in his hands, but in the one he served. He called to his servant, his voice filled with the weight of a promise yet to be fulfilled. "Go and look toward the sea," he said. The servant ran to the edge of the mountain, scanning the horizon where the blue of the sea met the sky. But as far as he could see, there was nothing, only the relentless sun and the endless expanse of a cloudless sky. He returned to Elijah and shook his head. "There is nothing there." Elijah's gaze did not waver. He simply nodded and said, "Go back." The servant went again and again and yet again. 6 times he climbed the rocky path, straining his eyes for any sign of change. And 6 times he returned with empty hands and empty news. But Elijah remained steadfast, his faith unbroken by the silence that stretched between his prayers and the answer he sought. "Go back," he told the servant for the 7th time. This time, as the servant stood on the ridge, something caught his eye. A tiny smudge against the pale sky, so small it could be missed with a blink. He squinted, leaning forward, and then it became clear. A single, small cloud was rising from the sea, no larger than a man's hand. The servant ran back, breathless with excitement. "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea," he exclaimed. Elijah's lips curved into a knowing smile, and he sprang to his feet. He turned to his servant, urgency sharpening his voice. "Go and tell Ahab. Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." The sky, which had been empty for so long, suddenly grew dark with swirling clouds. The wind picked up, whipping through the dry branches and stirring the dust from the ground. And then, all at once, the heavens opened. Rain poured down, drenching the thirsty earth, soaking the parched fields, and bringing life back to the land that had suffered so long. As the rain fell in torrents, Ahab rode his chariot back to Jezreel, but Elijah, filled with a strength not his own, gathered up his cloak and ran. He ran faster than the horses, faster than the wind, keeping pace with the chariot all the way to Jezreel. A journey that should have taken hours, but that Elijah made in the rush of divine power. But even as the rain fell, washing away the dust and the drought, a new storm was brewing. When Ahab reached the palace and told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how the prophets of Baal had been defeated, how the power of her gods had crumbled before the might of the Lord, her fury burned hotter than the fires of Carmel. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, her threat cutting through the sounds of the rain. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." The word struck Elijah like a blow. This queen, this enemy who clung to her false gods, vowed to end his life as she had ended so many others. And for the first time in all his years as a prophet, the fear was too much. The exhaustion of battles, miracles, and endless struggles pressed down on him, and he ran. He ran through the rain, through the wilderness, until he could run no more. He found himself alone in the desert, collapsing under the shade of a solitary broom tree. His strength spent, he cried out in despair, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." And there, in the emptiness of the wilderness, he fell into a deep, troubled sleep, hoping that maybe he would not wake again. But even in his darkest moment, God did not abandon him. As Elijah slept, an angel touched him gently, waking him from his despair. "Get up and eat," the angel said, and there, beside his head, was a loaf of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. Elijah ate and drank, but then he lay down again, the weight of his sorrow pulling him back into the darkness of sleep. A second time, the angel touched him, the voice firm yet filled with care. "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So Elijah ate and drank again, and this time, the food gave him strength beyond his own. Strength enough to walk 40 days and 40 nights through the wilderness until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Elijah found a cave there, hiding in its shadows, still haunted by fear and uncertainty. But in that cave, God's voice came to him. Not in the thunder or the fire, not in the power he had known on Mount Carmel, but in a still, small whisper. A whisper that cut through the noise of his fears and called him back to his purpose. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asked, and Elijah poured out his heart, speaking of the broken altars, the slain prophets, and his own loneliness. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he said. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." But God did not let him stay in the shadows of that cave. "Go back the way you came," the Lord said. "Anoint Hazael king over Aram, anoint Jehu king over Israel, and anoint Elisha to succeed you as prophet. And know this, I have preserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal." Elijah stepped out of the cave, the whisper still echoing in his ears, and the call to return to the land that he had left behind. He would not face the battles alone, nor would his legacy end in fear. There was more work to be done, more lives to touch, and a new prophet, Elisha, who would walk beside him as the torch of God's power passed into new hands. And so, with the whisper of God guiding him, Elijah began his long journey back, through the rain-soaked hills and the desert winds, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As Elijah made his way back from the solitude of Mount Horeb, his spirit steadied by the whisper of God, he found Elisha plowing a field with 12 yoke of oxen. It was an ordinary scene in a land where life struggled to return to normal after the drought. But for Elijah, it was the beginning of something new. He walked up to Elisha without a word and draped his own cloak over the young man's shoulders. A simple gesture, but one heavy with meaning. Elisha knew at that moment, the mantle of prophecy, of service to the Lord, was being passed on to him. Elisha ran after Elijah, calling out, "Let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will come with you." Elijah turned, his face serious but with a hint of a smile. "Go back," he replied, "but think about what I have done to you." It was a reminder that this path would demand everything, leaving behind the comforts of home and the life Elisha had known. Elisha returned to his family, but not to stay. He slaughtered the oxen, burned the plowing equipment to cook the meat, and gave it to the people to eat, a farewell feast, a symbol of his complete commitment to this new call. Then he set out, following Elijah, becoming his disciple, his companion on the long road of service to the eternal. They traveled together, Elijah teaching Elisha, preparing him for the battles and the burdens that come with speaking the words of God. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the shadow of another transition loomed. Elijah knew that his time on earth was drawing to an end. He could feel it in the way the air seemed to hum with something beyond the ordinary, a divine undercurrent that whispered of change. And soon, the moment came when God revealed that Elijah's departure was at hand. Elijah tried to send Elisha away, telling him to stay behind as he went from Gilgal to Bethel, and then to Jericho, but each time Elisha refused. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you," he insisted. So together they traveled on side by side until they reached the banks of the Jordan River. 50 prophets from the surrounding region gathered nearby, watching from a distance, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. The river parted, the waters forming a path of dry ground, and Elijah and Elisha crossed over together, just the two of them, as the crowd watched in awe. On the other side, Elijah turned to Elisha and asked, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit," he replied. It was a bold request, a plea to carry not just Elijah's mantle but his power, his strength, and his closeness with God, doubled to face the challenges that lay ahead. Elijah looked at him, understanding the weight of what Elisha had asked. "You have asked a difficult thing," he said, "but if you see me when I am taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not." They continued walking together, speaking of things that would soon be left unsaid. Then, suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, racing through the sky, separating the two of them with a blaze of divine light. Elijah was swept up into a whirlwind, lifted from the earth as if the heavens themselves had reached down to claim him. Elisha stood there, his face illuminated by the fiery glow, watching his mentor ascend in awe. My father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel," he cried out, his voice filled with both grief and wonder. But soon, there was nothing left but the swirling wind and the emptiness where Elijah had stood. The cloak, that familiar symbol of power and prophecy, fell to the ground before Elisha. He picked it up, holding it in his hands for a moment, feeling the weight of the legacy it carried. Then, with a determined step, he walked back to the Jordan River and struck the water with the cloak, just as he had seen Elijah do. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he called out, his voice ringing through the stillness. And the waters parted once more. The prophets who had watched from afar saw Elisha cross back over, and they knew that the spirit of Elijah now rested upon him. They bowed before him, recognizing the new prophet of Israel. But Elisha, holding the mantle of his mentor, understood that this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, battles against darkness, the whispers of false gods, and the needs of a people who still wavered in their faith. Elisha was now the one to carry the voice of the Eternal. But he carried more than just Elijah's mantle. He carried the memory of a man who had defied kings, who had stood alone on Mount Carmel, and who had listened to the still, small voice of God in the depths of a cave. And though Elijah's fiery chariot had taken him beyond the world of men, his legacy burned on, blazing a trail for Elisha to follow. With Elijah gone and the mantle resting on Elisha's shoulders, the young prophet began to walk the path his mentor had blazed before him. He took up the call to confront the waywardness of Israel, to guide those who still sought the true God, and to battle against the lingering shadows left by the worship of Baal. But there was more work to be done, and the memory of Elijah's boldness drove him forward with renewed purpose. The new kings came, and with them the political games of Israel and its neighbors. But God's hand was not idle. Elisha moved with divine purpose, anointing those whom God had chosen to reshape the future of the region. He found Hazael, a servant in Damascus, and with a heavy heart, delivered a prophecy that would change the course of Syria. "You will become king over Aram." The words sank like stones between them, and Elisha wept, knowing the violence and suffering that Hazael would unleash. Elisha's journey then led him to Jehu, a soldier in Israel who would become the instrument of God's judgment against the house of Ahab. Elisha sent one of his disciples to anoint Jehu as king, commanding him with a clear and terrifying message: You are to strike down the house of Ahab, your master. And you shall avenge the blood of my servants the prophets and the blood of all the Lord's servants shed by Jezebel." Jehu did not hesitate. He took up the sword with a fervor that shook Israel, riding swiftly through the land to purge the house of Ahab and Jezebel's legacy. He sought out the false prophets, the priests of Baal who had thrived under Ahab and Jezebel's rule, and swept through them like a fire through dry fields. Elisha, knowing the terrible necessity of what was unfolding, watched from a distance as Jehu carried out the decrees. The valley where the blood of prophets had cried out now flowed with the blood of those who had defiled God's name. And Jezebel, the queen who had sworn to end Elijah's life, met her end in a grisly fall, her body trampled and devoured by dogs, just as the prophecy had foretold. Jehu's fury swept through Israel like a storm, and with it, the altars of Baal fell one by one, toppled by the hands of those who had once bowed before them. The great temple of Baal was turned into a ruin, its idols shattered, its priests gone. But Elisha, knowing that the work of turning hearts was far from finished, continued his quiet, steadfast ministry among the people. He healed the sick, fed the hungry, and guided the remnant who still sought the face of the Lord. Yet even as Baal's followers were driven out, Elisha knew that true change would come not from the sword but from the slow turning of hearts back to God. He would carry the torch of faith, reminding the people of the God who had spoken through fire on Mount Carmel, who had fed Elijah by the brook, and who had brought life back into a widow's child. The years passed, and the power of Baal diminished, fading like a shadow before the morning sun. But Elisha's work remained, a labor that could not be finished with a single battle or a single prophecy. He moved among the people like the quiet wind, carrying Elijah's spirit of uncompromising faithfulness. And in his heart, Elisha carried the memory of that day on the mountain, when the fire had fallen and the people had cried out, "The Lord, He is God." He knew that the fire still burned, not in the temples of stone, but in the hearts of those who would hear the call, who would turn back from the darkness, and who would seek the voice of the Eternal in the still, small whispers that echoed in the depths of their souls. Elisha's mantle may have been a physical one, passed down from his mentor, but the real inheritance was the knowledge that God's power and presence were not limited to grand gestures and mighty displays. They lived on in the simple acts of faith, in the courage to stand alone, and in the unwavering hope that, even in the midst of judgment and turmoil, there could be a return to the truth. It was a legacy that stretched beyond one life, weaving through the fabric of Israel's history, leaving a mark that could not be erased. And as Elisha continued his journey, he knew that the story of God's faithfulness was far from over.